This is Robert Davidson. Welcome to Composers Talking. Today I'm speaking with Rudresh Mahanthappa, a New York-based saxophonist and composer, whose album Mother Tongue features his extraordinary work in which he improvises around melodies derived from various Indian languages such as Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, and even English. His band takes the melodic structures that he's discovered in recordings of these languages and creates quite amazing jazz improvisations around that. I asked Rudresh whether he was working within an Indian tradition, whether classical Indian music made use of speech melody in constructing its melodies.
No, not really. I mean, nothing beyond the fact that, Indian classical music, as it is even the instrumental music is all vocally based. And, I guess only in that, as you may know, Indian music, I mean, one of the most intriguing things, at least to me, about Indian classical music is the whole, how would I say it? Well, there's a whole training that takes place regarding ornamentation of a single note that has I guess for lack of a better word in Western terms, has kind of a microtonal quality to it. And a lot of times instrumental music in the Indian classical tradition is really, seems to me, to be about mimicking the voice. So you'll see that like the greatest Indian classical instrumentalists have a handle on that that particular style of ornamentation, which really, in trying to kind of emulate some of that on my own as far as a jazz player, it's something that makes much more sense as a vocalist, especially if you're playing something like saxophone, where getting those notes in between isn't necessarily the easiest thing.
Well, that's something which I found very interesting on Mother Tongue, that you are using a lot of microtonal transcriptions, I suppose, of the language. This is a question which does come up quite a lot in how you use speech melody, is how far you want to quantize it, I suppose, pitch-wise. Someone like Steve Reich, who's probably best known for using speech melody in different trains, though, it's probably not him who came up with it. But he does tend to put it into the 12 notes of the equal tempered scale.
To Los Angeles. To Los Angeles. To Los Angeles. Los Angeles. To Los Angeles. New York, New York.
Were you still fitting it into sort of specific quarter tones, or were you really trying to get it as accurately, matching the speech as possible?
That's a good question. That's so hard because, my biggest challenge was ultimately I wanted to come up with something that, the end result, the music I brought to my quartet and ended up recording was, I wanted something that was playable and something that was also listenable. So I guess I kind of stopped short of going quote unquote all the way with that, both with regard to pitch and rhythm, because then rhythmically, obviously, transcribing speech gets into some really some really jagged things that are very interesting for sure, but I'm not sure. I mean, the rough transcriptions I was looking at initially were, I didn't ever know how I was actually going to play those and have somebody else play them.
ભારતમાં ઘણી બધી ભાષાઓ બોલાય છે અને ગુજરાતી એમાંની એક ભાષા છે. અમેરિકામાં રહેવાથી હું અંગ્રેજી પણ બોલું છું.
and I was also concerned with how, the setting of the transcription too. Like, so here I have a rough transcription, and maybe it's quantized to some extent pitch with regard to pitch and with regard to rhythm, but then what is actually going to happen compositionally? What's going to happen in the piano? What's going to happen in the drums and in the bass? So I guess I was trying to somehow average all of that to make good music and to make something that also fits my compositional style or compositional voice. That's a tough one, though, because I think anyone who deals with the speech melody stuff has to ask themselves those tough questions or confront those difficult bridges to cross as far as how far they want to go, and maintaining the integrity of the purpose of the piece as opposed to maintaining the integrity of a compositional style.
Yeah, sure. But I guess your attitude has leaned more towards preserving the sources, hasn't it, really?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I tried to preserve the source to the greatest extent possible. And, I think different than, than maybe Reich's work or in jazz circles, I don't know if you're familiar with Jason Moran, the piano player.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So, and he's done some stuff recently where he's transcribed different, I think it was actually telephone conversations, and he plays along with them note for note.
Tamam peki. Ben cebini açıp bırak, ben seni ararım. I will call you. Okay.
And I wasn't really concerned with doing that. I just felt like people had already done that, particularly Reich and also Hermeto Pascoal.
Exatamente isso, minha gente. Pensamento negativo atrai pensamento negativo. Pensamento positivo é o que os ingleses chamam wishful thinking, né? Pensar positivo, querer pensar positivo atrai bons fluidos. Eu sei exatamente os instrumentos de que nós precisamos dispor para atingir esse objetivo.
About maintaining some integrity, a great integrity of the source material, but maybe going in a different direction with it. I mean, for example, you can't play the speech sample along with the pieces on mother tongue because there's been too much manipulation that's happened as far as rhythm, as far as even tempo. Maybe the speech transcription is flying by, but to me there was so much in there, so much rich material in there, both melodically and rhythmically, that I wanted, in preserving that, maybe the tune that we end up playing that's based on all of that is maybe running at half the speed and in a different key or something,
The amazing thing, though, is that you do really preserve, a lot of the emotional intent of the speaker, it seems. I mean, when you listen to the recording, especially when you get to know it, it does speak to you quite amazingly. Is that something you found yourself?
Well, I appreciate you saying so. That's great. I definitely, that was a great intention for sure. That was something that I tried my best to do. I'm glad that you picked up on it.
Well, I was just wondering also, do you find that the different languages have a different musical quality as well? Like, do they have different, maybe interval patterns or, ranges, or there's sort of notes which come out more often? Anything like that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I definitely feel that way. I felt like the South Indian languages seem to have a more interesting pitch content. They seem to have more of a, for lack of a better word, singing quality to them. I noticed some interesting key center issues because there were some speech samples that didn't get used. For some languages, maybe I had 2 or 3 speech samples and then only chose to use one. But it was kind of eerie to see that you would have 3 speakers of one language saying essentially the same thing, and that there were a lot of similarities, and 3 speakers of 3 different ages and 3 different genders and 3 different backgrounds, and the rhythmic content was very similar. The range was similar, and the key was exactly the same, actually, of each one. Well, key, I guess, in the sense that maybe, not that it was in one specific key, but the pitches that where maybe a phrase came to rest on was almost always the same, which I thought was a little bit spooky.
That does sound spooky. So you're saying that they were saying the same basic meaning in different languages, and basically the intonation was relatively similar then?
Yeah, definitely. Like I remember one where the speakers always seemed to rest on F, and like a sentence ended on F, and I just thought that was a little bit frightening. And the similarity in the pace and the rhythm kind of also freaked me out a little bit. I mean, maybe it shouldn't, but you would think maybe in starting a project like this that every sample is going to be radically different, because we really think about voices, especially speaking voices, as being so distinct. I think at least from the outset we do. Like, I know that my voice really doesn't sound like many other people's voices, for example. And so I was pretty intrigued by that. As far as really necessarily the Indian languages being a tonal language, I think that would take a good bit more research. But I definitely think there's something there. I think there's definitely some unifying elements. I just not sure when I'm going to have the time to actually figure out what those are specifically.
What about your own voice? Have you found any things in the way you speak and the way you play, maybe the way you improvise? Is there any link?
People have often told me that the way I improvise is very similar to the way I speak. I'm not sure what they're saying what they mean when they say that. But in screwing around with transcribing my own voice, I definitely see some interesting similarities as far as range, as far as maybe, how would I say it? Interval content, for sure. Like, I think it's like I love dealing with these kind of what we call maybe Fibonacci groupings or golden section groupings, kind of a la Bartok, and both as an improviser and composer. And in dissecting my own speech, I definitely saw a lot of that as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. Yeah,
it's interesting you mentioned that, because that's something I've been looking at. John Lennon's voice, just chose that one for some reason, and I found a lot of his speech has the same interval proportions as a lot of his melodies. So it points in an interesting direction, I think, that there could be something about how we speak is related to how we sing or play.
I think it's definitely there. I mean, I think it's. I always feel like not enough people think about the fact. Well, at least the state of jazz and improvisation and has become schooled to this degree that has become codified to this degree that well, it's a little bit disgusting, I guess, in a way. And I think like very basic things, such as your improvisational voice, or even just the pure sound that you get out of your instrument being related to your voice. And I think we're kind of getting far away from those kinds of ideas, and I think that's something that a lot of Eastern music has managed to managed to hold on to. So I think we can all kind of take a cue from that, step back and embrace the idea of some sort of meta voice that permeates what any individual does.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you think of Lester Young or John Coltrane, they definitely had that, didn't they? They had their own sound, which somewhat related to how they spoke.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I was talking to a fellow today, and I told him that the reason I play so many, it sounds angry because I'm trying so many things at one time, you see. Like I haven't sorted them out. I have a whole bag of things that I'm trying to work through and get the one essential, you know.
Would you say that you're trying to play everything you hear at one time or something like that?
No, there are some set things that I know, some devices that I know, harmonic devices that I know that will take me out of the ordinary path, you see, if I use these. But I haven't played them enough, and I'm not familiar with them enough yet to take the one single line through them. So I play all of them, you know, trying to acclimate my ear so I can hear, you know.
Charlie Parker too, and just, you know, the idea of personality. Like, I mean, if you've seen interviews with Charlie Parker or something like that, you feel like his personality as an improviser is his personality. That there's this one voice, and whether he's talking or whether he's playing his horn, it's all kind of one continuum. And I definitely feel like Indian music has managed to hang on to that, and most musics that are, you know, seem to be passed down and sort of in more of an oral tradition seem to maintain that. And, you know, when you talk about people like Lester Young or Coltrane, I think that's still very much at a time where jazz was being passed down as an oral tradition much more so than it is now.
Sure, yeah. And well, just coming to Coltrane, it's interesting how with A Love Supreme, I haven't looked into this in detail, but I believe that there was some text that he had in his mind as he was improvising that. Do you know about that story? I
actually don't. No, I don't know about that. But that reminds me of something I was thinking about the other day, though. Do you know Gary Bartz, the pretty famous alto saxophonist? He's really amazing. He's sometimes I get compared to him. He's one of these alto players that kind of came up through the late 60s and through the 70s, and he's one of the few alto players that seem to be coming from a more tenor saxophone sort of perspective, as far as maybe trying to deal with Coltrane's vocabulary more than, I don't know, maybe like more than Cannonball Adderley or something like that. But one time I took a lesson with him about 10 or 12 years ago, and one of the things we talked about that still really resonates in my head is when playing standards, he actually talked about the fact that when he plays a standard, well, he always plays tunes that he knows the lyrics to, if he's playing, you know, standard material, and that he really has the lyrics going in his head when he plays the melody, and that he tries to somehow evoke particular, you know, maybe vowel sounds or even consonants as far as the way he attacks a note. That he tries to evoke that while he's playing the melody, and I thought that was really, really heavy, you know. And we were playing real basic standards like "What is this thing called love?" and "I'll Remember April," and because I remember I was just kind of blowing through these melodies, and he stopped me, and then he played the melody, and there was a certain depth to the way he just played this very basic melody, and it wasn't like he was embellishing it, or he didn't even need to embellish it. There was something about, he evoked something else that, you know, all I can think is that he's kind of trying to shape the sound as though he were singing the actual words.
That's really interesting you mentioned that too, because I just, funnily enough, yesterday I was listening to an interview with the great South Indian violinist T.N. Krishnan, and he said that that's one of the biggest concerns in playing solo violin in South India is to always have the text, the lyrics running through your mind, and that's the biggest challenge in playing instrumental music in Carnatic tradition.
Yeah, certainly, and that that also gets back. Yeah, I mean that's the amazing thing about all the Indian instrumentalists is that they all. I mean, obviously, each the great improvisers and great soloists have their. They have an identity on their instrument, of course, that's recognizable and whatever. But there is all this idea of always singing through your instrument, regardless of what instrument you play, is something that permeates all of it, which I think is another, is another aspect of for lack of a better word, Eastern perspective that I think Western instrumentalist music may have lost sight of. I mean, I think that's why there's some really great pop instrumentalists, I think, that actually managed to hold on to that, or folk instrumentalists that hold on to that. But again, I think, the pitfalls of jazz, it's more about knowing 100 2-5-1 patterns and not really singing through your instrument,
I guess the difficulty has become in jazz that in some ways it's gone the direction of some classical music where it became over-formalized, and you've been credited with bringing some fresh air in, which is a great thing by looking at these other traditions. I was wondering, actually, have you had much training in Carnatic tradition, or did you come from that background at all?
No. I mean, I haven't had any formal training. I mean, my parents are South Indian, and I grew up with plenty of Indian music being played in the house. Not so much the classical music, though. More the kind of religious music, like the bhajans. But I think the way I've dealt with Indian music is much like I've dealt with jazz. I mean, I think there was a time where, and still occasionally if I have time, but there was a time when I would try to transcribe, South Indian solos, Carnatic solos in the same way I was trying to transcribe, Coltrane solos or David Liebman solos, So I just tried to get at it that way. I mean, and I've read a lot, and I understand how a lot of rhythmic structures, and I deal with all those, a lot of rhythmic structures, when I'm writing as well. So I feel like I have a good handle on the conceptual notions of Carnatic music and some, Hindustani music as well. But I haven't studied anything formally. I've been a little bit hesitant to do that. Well, hesitant for a few reasons. One is that I have a feeling if I started studying that formally, I would be so concerned with the idea that I don't have a second lifetime to devote to that, for starters. And also, what I enjoy about the way I've absorbed Indian music is that I still deal with it, in dealing with it on this conceptual level, which obviously can be deepened as opposed to this formal level. I feel like I maintain a certain sense of expressing Indian American identity. I guess I don't want my own music to ever sound so blatantly Indian, because I don't necessarily feel so blatantly Indian on any given day. So it's about striking this balance between everything that informs me culturally and for that to come out in the music. But on the flip side of all of that, I just applied for the Guggenheim Fellowship, and part of my year of study was going to involve a couple of trips to India to go and study. So we'll just have to see how I can temper all of it.
Well, and would that involve? In one of your interviews, you mentioned that you're not finished with the Mother Tongue project. Is that going to continue?
Maybe at some point. It's definitely not at the front of my mind. I think. I was thinking. I think one of my next projects, or at least next forays, is going to be to work with some electronic stuff. And I think if I pursue the remainder of mother tongue, so to speak. It might be more in that setting and not so much, the acoustic jazz setting.
You mean you may you'll use the recordings and then transcribe them with electronic instruments, perhaps?
Yeah, and maybe the speech samples or the transcriptions will be more like electronic loops as opposed to, playing, as opposed to me just playing, as opposed to it being the speech transcription becoming a melody and then setting the melody with a traditional Western rhythm section or something. I think it's just going to manifest differently, and I'm not, I don't quite hear it in my head, but just yet, but I'm thinking more about it.
Mentioning repetition and looping, that's something I wanted to ask about before. Is it seems like that's one pretty strong way, I guess, that you can take a speech melody and really make it into music, because you don't have a lot of repetition when you speak, or much less. Have you thought much about some of the ways that speech melody can be turned into musical melody? In addition to, say, repetition or accompaniment?
Well, that was something I played around with in mother tongue, because I know, like, so far I've been stressing this idea of where the melody is, where I was more concerned with setting the melody, but that's not entirely accurate. Especially, there are 2 or 3 tracks where the bass line is maybe more based on the speech than the melody is, and I think, or even like certain drum patterns. It was actually kind of a funny coincidence, or a funny error on my part, where I was playing around with a bass line that was based on that was pretty much exactly a fragment of the speech, and I was using Sibelius, and I accidentally pasted it into the drum part instead of the bass part. that launched me into something else entirely. So I think there are lots of different things that can be done. I mean, and what I would like to investigate more, I think, maybe when I get back to the mother tongue stuff, is the rhythmic elements, because I think the rhythmic elements are as fascinating as the melody,
Sure. I mean, and in a way that would, I guess the whole area of rap and hip hop focuses on the rhythmic aspect of speech more than pitch, and I'm not sure where I'm going with that question, but I suppose, yeah, is there any relationship between what you're doing and, say, hip hop or any of that tradition?
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. I was another fantasy project of mine is to deal with, some, like, a rapper, or some sort of MC. I think, the person who comes to mind always for me is as my rhythmic rap hero is Busta Rhymes, at least in the mainstream. There are lots of underground people that are very interesting too, but Busta Rhymes, he has some really, really interesting rhythmic things happening, like the way he kind of lays back on something, or some things that happen that are maybe polyrhythmic if you sat down and dissected them, and the way he always kind of lands on whether it's one or whether it's like the top of his phrase, whether it starts on one or not. It's like, I think there's some interesting parallels between what he does, if you could isolate his track, and maybe what a South Indian percussionist would do. It's pretty interesting. So yeah, I guess there's plenty of fodder out there to work with, and maybe to kind of unify a bunch of genres and styles, and completely different kinds of music. Again, and that gets back to this idea of like the meta song or the meta rhythm, and all these things that bring music from around the world together. Getting back to mother tongue, I think, I guess for me, the album was, obviously, there were a few different motivations to do the record. I think that, as a composer and, somebody that grew up kind of surrounded by the sciences, and I guess there is this kind of academic or studied or experimental bent to what I do, or to the way I go about doing what I do. I think it's always fascinated me to really look outside of music for inspiration. So that was definitely, a huge proponent of, or a huge push for pursuing this particular track, because I was, put in the situation of really, I guess I wrote this music, but, I pretty much had the melodies that I had to deal with that I didn't write from scratch. So that was actually a more difficult proposition than maybe writing tunes completely from scratch, where I've conceived of the melody and then I, go about writing the rest of the parts or orchestrating it accordingly. And then, of course, there's the social element too. I mean, it's an interesting project because of the speech melody aspect, but to me, it's a more interesting project because I was more concerned with trying to, diffuse certain stereotypes about, what it means to be Indian or what it means to be Indian American, and so I guess that was my huge concern in writing all that music, and I think that's why. Well, let's see. I guess in that sense, I felt like it was more. I guess I'm concerned with socially aware music, and I think Bartok, as much as he's hailed as being this, visionary in academic classical terms, I think he was very much dealing with social music, and in being very kind of concerned with the nationalistic identity of his people, So I guess that's something I think about in addition to thinking about everything else, for whatever that's worth.
Well, in a way, sort of like you're saying, the meta.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess it goes back to all of that again, right?
Yeah, there was another point you mentioned back a bit, but the thing you were saying about the Busta Rhymes using the, I guess, Mora sort of style patterns where you have the little phrases which don't necessarily align with the meter in the same way each time. Is that what you were talking about before?
Yeah, these rhythmic cadences almost where, like South Indian percussion is. Let's say if you're setting up a mora or a korvai or something like that, the idea is that you're going to, if you play a particular rhythmic cadence like that, you're either going to come out on beat one, or you're going to come out, or you're going to finish on the beat where the melody starts, which could be, wherever that's designated. It might be the upbeat of 7 or the downbeat of 4, something like. So this idea of coming out on some that's something that Busta does really well, he might say some real rhythmically deal with some crazy stuff but he always lands there. It's kind of frightening. Yeah, something to definitely think about.
I think you do notice some of that sort of stuff in breakbeat music too, where they are using small segments of a breakbeat, and sometimes it really does sound like it's doing some of these more sort of patterns as well.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, and there's some really interesting. I don't know any names, but there's some interesting. Somebody burned me a bunch of the breakbeat stuff that's coming out of London, and I definitely felt that same way. That there's you could easily throw like a very schooled Indian percussionist into that mix, and it would all make sense, And I'm sure the Brits are definitely doing that too.
I just wanted to say, Rudresh, it's been fantastic to have your influence coming into jazz and really bring in some fresh new ideas So thank you for that. And I just wondered if there's any final remarks you had about mother tongue.
Well, thank you for having me. I think I don't know if I have much else to say. I think I'm glad that the album did resonate with the people that managed to get it. I think as far as being a jazz musician in this day and age, the music doesn't necessarily get out there like it should because of the nature of the industry. But I'm glad that you and others saw that there was something in there, and I appreciate that a lot. And thank you for having me as part of this part of your interview process here.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time, and all the best.
All right, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you down there sometime.
Rudresh Mahanthappa there, speaking with me, Robert Davidson, about his album Mother Tongue on Composers Talking. See you next time.